I wish things were different.
Ellie!
But they ain't.
Please stop!
With the film and TV industries having been put on hold for the last couple of months, there's a fair case to be made that 2020 has actually been a bit of a highlight year for gaming. After all, with cinemas out of action, Hollywood has struggled to quench the thirst for new content, but gaming hasn't had that problem at all. We've seen some huge titles come out this year: Animal Crossing, Doom Eternal, Ghost of Tsushima, and of course, The Last of Us Part 2. Now, while I usually keep the focus of this channel on film and TV, gaming is still a huge passion of mine, and I just completed The Last of Us Part 2, and suffice to say, I have a lot to say about it, so I just couldn't help myself, and I feel like this video had to be made. But before we dive into that discussion, I just want to say, as always, thank you for coming to my channel. If you have subscribed, thank you very much. If you've yet to do so, why not do so now? It'll make my day if you do. And of course, before we get into this, huge spoilers for The Last of Us Part 2, so if you haven't played the game, please do so before watching this video. But anyway, let's dive right in. Even now, nearly 2 months after the game's release, it's still kind of difficult to talk about The Last of Us Part 2 for the amount of contention that it's drawn within the gaming community, and it's not entirely hard to see why. I can understand the frustration with seeing a main character like Joel mercilessly killed right from the get-go, and the game's overall tone is pretty bleak with the exception of a few moments of romance between Ellie and Dina. And reviews, both positive and negative for the game, have at the very least latched onto the game's main theme, which is that revenge can be this all-consuming pursuit. Not just to the people directly involved, but also to the people on the sidelines who are unlucky enough to get in the way. It's a theme that's also explored in Martin McDonagh's 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, which is a great example of how a quest for revenge pretty much decimates a small American town and the fallout as a result of that. But I do feel that fans and critics seem to have missed one key theme in the game, and that's narrative perspective. In literature, our understanding of a story can be completely dictated by a narrator. They can decide what to show us and what to withhold. And gaming's not too dissimilar. In fact, if there's one thing that gaming has done consistently over the years, it's in turning our virtual enemies into cannon fodder. Strangely enough, the Uncharted series is one of the worst culprits for this, and I love that series, but Nathan Drake takes out a small country during the course of those games and rarely bats an eyelid. The Last of Us Part 2 subverts this trend by getting us to know almost every single enemy faction within the game. We have Abby from the Washington Liberation Front, and Lev and Yara from the Seraphites. The game hammers this point home even further in combat, as enemies will call out the names of their fallen comrades, adding an extra layer of humanity to the whole proceeding. Going back to our original duo, players are more attached with Joel and Ellie from the beginning because we understand their backstory better than any other character in the game. But let's forget about those two for a second and put ourselves in the position of a young Abby. Here's someone who grew up in the game's post-apocalyptic world with only her dad to look out for her. As one of the last remaining doctors in the world, her father finally gets a lead on a potential cure for the virus that has ravaged society. But before he can make said cure, he's killed by an unknown assailant. In this instance, not only has this person killed Abby's father, but they've also doomed society to keep on living with the effects of the virus. So Abby joins a new faction, trains incessantly for years, and in the end becomes one of the top soldiers within that group, and finally enacts revenge by hunting down her father's killer. That on its own seems like a heroic storyline, but because we've spent time with Joel and Ellie, Abby becomes the villain that we want to take down. The truly gut-wrenching thing about The Last of Us Part 2 is that while we get to see the humanity in all of these characters, they never get to see that in each other. Interestingly enough, Abby's story isn't too dissimilar to Ellie's, it's just happening a couple of beats ahead. At the beginning of The Last of Us Part 2, Abby's revenge story is complete, but as we see from her recurring nightmares, it hasn't brought her any closure. It's only when she's presented with a chance to help Lev and Yara, much like how Joel was presented with the task of caring for Ellie, that Abby starts to find her humanity again. Of course, Ellie isn't privy to any of this, so the need for revenge becomes all-encompassing as there's no empathy to counteract it, which leads to the deaths of Abby's closest friends. In the end, while it might seem anticlimactic to see Ellie spare Abby's life right at the last second, we actually get to witness Ellie pulling herself back from the brink and deciding not to engage in the cycle of violence, or make the same mistake that Abby did. After all, with Lev present at the final battle, there was always a chance that he could then hunt Ellie in reverse, at which point the cycle of violence just continues. By introducing us to most of the factions within the game, The Last of Us Part 2 really makes gamers consider the seemingly never-ending cycle of violence that we're just subjected to. And in the game's final act, I actually found myself disgusted at the idea of killing another virtual human being. The game shows us how a shifting perspective can really make you reconsider the humanity in someone that you might have written off as a one-note character. It shows you that for every person you take down, they could just as easily have their own story about how they got to that position. We just never get to see it. Well, The Last of Us Part 2 gives us a peek through that looking glass, and it ends up delivering one of the most thought-provoking narratives I've played in years. But as always, I'd love to put the question to you. Do you feel the same way about The Last of Us Part 2? Has this video maybe changed your opinion somewhat on the game's narrative style? Or are you completely set in the way that actually the first game just couldn't be topped? Well, whatever your opinions are, please let me know in the comments below.
We could have killed you. Maybe you should have.